Welcome to this traffic safety webinar sponsored by the North Carolina Governor's Highway Safety Program. This is one in a series of webinars addressing topics of interest for traffic safety professionals. The series is co-hosted by the Institute for Transportation Research and Education at NC State University and the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center. Today's topic is the comprehensive cost of rail incidents in North Carolina, presented by Roger Smock with the NCDOT Rail Division and Steve Burt with Planning Communities, LLC. Roger is a rail safety consultant for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, where he manages the Be Rail Safe Rail Safety Outreach Program. Be Rail Safe provides rail safety education for public safety professionals, transportation stakeholders, and the general public. Roger champions railroad trespassing research, conducts case studies, and undertakes follow-up investigations of highway crossing crashes and trespasser fatalities. Steve is the Chief Strategy Officer and Principal Economist at Planning Communities. His professional career includes both academic and consultative services in the areas of economic, geospatial, and data analysis, tool development, policy evaluation, and transportation planning. Steve is formerly with ITRI at NC State, where he developed the publicly available comprehensive cost of rail incidents tool. The tool is used to estimate the economic and social costs that result from rail collisions and other safety events. Roger and Steve, thank you for joining us today. And Roger, if you'll please share your screen now to begin the presentation. And if you'll also turn on your camera if you wish.
Thank you, Eugene. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Be sure to click the share button.
Share we go.
Okay, it's coming up now. All right, we see it, sir. Go ahead.
Excellent. Hey, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to present with Steve. And I've been participating in this webinar series, and it's a great partnership with GHSP that you've come up with some great presenters and great topics. So Steve's the star of the show today to speak about the economic impact and the tool. I'm just going to set a frame of reference on what our rail picture looks like in North Carolina, the casualties with a focus on the trespass epidemic. So what is NCDOT's Be Rail Safe? It's a program, an outreach program to prevent rail-related injuries and deaths in North Carolina, and proudly say that North Carolina is the only state agency with such an outreach program. So a testament to NCDOT's leadership and their dedication to all things safety. So here's an infographic from FRA. Paints a picture, show you here the rail system in the United States. There are about 835 railroad companies in the United States. They operate about 140,000 miles of track and about 207,000 at-grade public crossings. And that system, is an economic generator, of course. And over the past 5 years, you'll see here in the top center, about 450 fatalities in 2015, trespassing, and that has risen by 19% through 2019. In the 5-year crossing trends, railroad crossing trends, there are about 237 crossing fatalities, and that in 2015 that had risen to 299. So despite what you'll see later in some data, that 5-year trend on the crossing fatalities has been trending up the past 5 years, but over the past 40 has dropped drastically. So that's a concern of ours as well. So North Carolina has an extensive rail network operating in 86 counties. That network of rail contributes about 1.8 billion to North Carolina's economy. Have 2 Class 1 railroads plus Amtrak that operates 22 short line railroads and combined, there's over 3,000 miles of track there. The state owns its own, the state of North Carolina owns its own rail corridors with about 100 miles of track, and we support our daily passenger service between Raleigh and Charlotte, and another train, the Carolinian, between Charlotte and New York daily. So rail is very important to North Carolina. And here's a picture of our U.S. rail events. Kind of overall, you'll see that a rail incident occurs about every 3 hours somewhere in the United States. That's a person or a vehicle on the tracks, of course, being struck by a train, and someone dies about every 10 and a half hours. So again, another picture of our U.S. rail incidents. Crossing crashes nationally from 1981, we were about 9,300 with 700 fatalities. In 2020, about 1,900, about 198 fatalities. So that's an 80% decrease in crashes, 72% decrease in fatalities. It's a good thing. There's programming behind that that's contributed to this. Crossing closures, separations of grades, at grade crossings, and other things. But as you see, the past 5 years, it's been a trend up in railroad crossing crashes. And the trespassing fatalities, I'm not a fan of the word trespassing, but it is the industry standard. That's a person who's walking on the tracks is considered a trespasser. That pedestrian, whether they're aware that it is illegal or not, is considered a trespasser. And 1985-81, the average trespassing fatalities in the United States is about 434. In 2019, that figure's 535. With a, see that right there is a 19% average increase over 39 years. Well, we have been in that past 40 years, that same time period, and an 80% decrease in railroad crossing crashes. Unfortunately, North Carolina is ranked nationally in trespassing fatalities the past 10 years, averaging 7th. And since the 80s, we've been, our trespass fatalities have been in the upper teens to low 20s. It's not a recent concern. This is railroad trespassing has been a concern for some time. This article from the Scientific American, 2 July 1910, it's titled "The Annual Slaughter of Trespassers on Railroads." Some very strong language throughout this this article. Very interesting read, a lot of history in there. But they go on to say that in 1907, there were over 5,600 trespass fatalities, or about 15 per day. So we have made some great improvement. We have room for a lot more improvement with our trespassing and our crossing crashes. This is North Carolina specific data. Our crossing crash fatalities from 81 through 2020. Well, we've experienced in blue is the crossing crash, if you can see, and the crossing crash fatalities are in orange. Had a 75% decrease in crashes and 62% decrease in fatalities. Doing some good things, going the right direction. We haven't experienced the slight uptick in crossing crashes that on the national picture. So that's good for us. However, our trespassing incidents and fatalities in that same time period are virtually unchanged. We continue to have about the same amount of incidents and fatalities, which is very concerning. It has the economic impact on our routes of freight passenger service, disrupting that that network that's connected to the national network of rail. Leaves a lasting impact on the community's quality of health in those communities, and as well as a host of other things. So, some of these questions may be rhetorical. Some are for maybe you to put your ideas in the chat. But if our crossing crashes are overall down in that 40-year period, and our trespassing incidents have continued to maintain that same rise. So the question is why? Is it an overlooked issue, a lack of awareness? I'll offer that there is no systemic program of education about rail safety in our society, in schools. It's not a part of health education programs, other safety programs that are generally attached to school, our public school system. And it's not a part of our driver education program as well, which would be a good place for that. So a lack of that is probably a large contributing factor. Many of you listening now, unless you work in the rail environment, probably didn't know or understand that all railroad property is private property. Some of these social beliefs and just the conditioning of living in a rail community, rail in your community. A lot of people believe it's like a public highway, and it's not. It is private business. It's an industrial business, and we fail to educate the folks on that to understand that as a class 3 misdemeanor, but beyond it being a crime, that it is dangerous and deadly. My experience with law enforcement is sometimes it's considered a victimless crime. Walking on private property or walking down the tracks or across the tracks at an unauthorized location as it gets lower or no enforcement. And in fact, it is not a victimless crime. These folks that are that die on these tracks, they deserve better. It's not a victimless crime. So there's no systemic countermeasure programs in place until recently. The FRA just started a rail trespassing enforcement program with a little bit of funding, a little seed money grant program 3 years ago. And until that time, there was, and it's not systemic. They've kept it going. It's their 3rd or 4th year, but there are no true recurring programs with funding. Some other observations I've made of there might be some unintended consequences of some zoning planning, decades ago, when communities and the zoning of those communities sometimes created food deserts and deserts for activities of daily living that some of those folks need. And there might be the nearest crossing some distance away, and those folks in that community would choose to walk across the tracks at an unauthorized location. So those are some things to think about. You can put your comments in the chat or have some questions about those. But it is not a victimless crime. This is Yasmin White, 11-year-old, who lost her life on crossing the track. I had to put a picture with, we talk about data and we look at that, and but there's a human connected to all these, whether they're 11 years old or 47 years old that died last week in Thomasville. I look at the adults that die who are unaware, do not understand that it's illegal or dangerous to be on the tracks. I look at all of them as 11-year-old Yasmin White, because that 47-year-old should have gotten some education that we failed Yasmin when she was 11 as well. And we also failed educating, providing a best practice for Yasmin's parents and grandparents. That's something our society has failed to do. So unfortunately, there are victims, but all too often they're considered immediately classified as a criminal because they do label them as trespasser. So NCDOT is, I'm proud to say, very committed to rail safety. And as a testament to their, showing you some funded rail research projects that puts North Carolina as a national leader in railroad trespass research. And on the screen, you'll see that the different projects there, reduction in railroad right-of-way trespassing incidents, and as a 2015, 2017 project, rail corridor trespasses severity assessment, rail network trespass statewide severity assessment and predictive modeling. I'll speak on a little bit of that later on Sarah Searcy's behalf. Also doing ongoing research right now is a dynamic camera detection, trespass detection, mounted on front and rear of some freight locomotives that we're testing and trying to proof to get a better count and understanding of behaviors of trespassers when they're in a rail environment. Additionally, we have the pedestrian incident detection using artificial intelligence, which is the second part of we did the software implementation, and now that's the actual field work. So they have similar names, and but one's the proofing for the software, getting that up and going. And then Steve's work, he'll speak about the comprehensive cost of rail incidents in North Carolina. Research and Development's also been very supportive of their technical assistant request when Rail Division has a need to study or analyze certain acute needs in the field, and their technology transfer program, which moves these research products, to the end user, to the field, to the end user that will make use of this. So it's a great testament, and wouldn't be able to be here today without their assistance. So Sarah could not make it, had an emergency come up a couple days ago, so I'm going to speak about the you'll see the rail network trespass statewide severity assessment and predictive modeling, the NC 2019-08 research. So this was led by the primary investigator, Sarah Searcy. She's at INCRE, and she's a bicycle and pedestrian program manager. I'll put these links to the research in the chat after I speak, while Steve's speaking, so you can get your own copy. All right. So just highlights from this, just an overview of it. The work that Sarah did was 2019-08 work, was actually built upon the 2017-15 rail corridor trespass severity assessment. So that allows Sarah 4 years of data, and that data was collected from 6 camera sites and 5 from 2017 across North Carolina. It used a thermal motion activated thermal camera to record 24/7 for 4 years. It recorded in all week 2 to 4 weeks in each of these data-driven trespass sites across the state in each season. So we would have a fair representation of that community's activity. It also built upon that previous data to help create predictive models. Those predictive models are very important for us to be able to share with community leaders and policymakers, have a better picture and profile of what their trespass activity looked like. So, whoops. This is some of that, some of the technology used there, solar panels to charge the batteries there. In the lower right, you'll see the battery box with recording device in there, and the camera you'll see in the top center mounted on the post there. They set these up for 2 to 4 weeks at certain sites across the state. and record and then reduce that in the office later on. Yeah. This is what the thermal imaging looked like. It will show trespassers due to our IRB rules do not allow that, protect those images. You'll see the rail is highlighted there in what looks like the white hot versus the ballast in between the gravel, which is a darker. Those camera sites were across the state and totaled 11 different sites in Charlotte, Durham, Elon, Gastonia, Greensboro, Lumberton, Mebane, Raleigh, Rocky Mount, Salisbury, and Shelby, all data driven. You can see the number of events that were recorded that met the strict rules to be qualified as a trespasser. And each event from some of those sites, you'll see 525 recorded from the Charlotte site, Greensboro 2,912, the number of days that those events occurred, 2,912 trespassers in Greensboro, and number of dates with those events, 69 days, so averaging 42 events per day. Exceeded, I know we have a lot of trespassing in some of our communities I'm familiar with, but even these results shocked me. So the grand total of those 11 sites over those 11 camera sites was 15,570 documented trespassers. And out of 721 observation days, 652 days of trespasser activity, 95% of those folks were crossing the tracks, 5% kind of moved along those tracks. And interesting enough, the median time for these folks on these tracks were about 3 seconds. So they were moving along. They were wanting to get from one side to the other is what we learned. So the trespass duration in the summary and distance, screen shows you the distance to the nearest authorized safe crossing from the camera site where the trespassing unauthorized path is. So we documented that, and some of these folks could cross as little as 165 feet away. Some were further, but our national data shows that an alarming number of trespass events happen in less than 500 feet from an authorized crossing. And surely our trespassing data supports those figures as well. So some of the feature findings of Sarah's work is the research team hypothesized that most of these folks just had a need to get from one side to the other. They took the most direct route that they had. 35% of those folks were traveling in groups of 2 or more. A train was present out of these 15,000 events. A train was present while these trespassers were in the interact near the railroad tracks 1% of the time. So that comes out to about 150 of these documented events had a train present, which is pretty scary. So some of the data, I pull this out and wanted to scale that. If you scale some of the data from Elon, Mebane, or Greensboro from these, this was one single trespassing path. I found this pretty alarming. If you scale the days that we observed activity there and scale that to for the entire year, you'll see that Elon probably experienced about 12,000 trespassers in that one path per year. That's about the population of Elon. Mebane, similar, about 11,000. Greensboro, 15,000 trespassers in that one single path in Rocky Mount. So we know in many, many communities that there are a number of trespassing paths, in a 2 or 3 mile stretch, especially in the more congested areas where there's a lot of residents. So This is in one path, so you can understand that this is a serious problem and presents a huge danger. So what we learned was people were traveling alone in pairs, they were adults. We saw children being carried in strollers, bicycles, and children, people walking dogs. What we learned is everybody, pretty much it went across the entire genre of folks. Mostly people just needing to get from one side to the other. They didn't linger. They moved along, and unfortunately, some of these folks don't make it to the other side, as we witnessed last week in Lexington and Thomasville. So, who's trespassing? As I just said, age, race, or sex. Pretty much everyone. Yeah, not one single demographic. They also learned the magnitude of trespassing is much greater than the FRA's reporting. FRA report, the Federal Railroad Administration reports, strikes or and where we're trying to gain a better understanding beyond that is actually the actual incidents that do not involve strikes, to have a better picture of what that community's needs are. The profile of the average trespasser for the FRA was a white male, about 38 years of age, impaired, and 2/3 of those are between age 20 and 49. We didn't have age and race, sex data, but observations from the camera that suggested this needed to be looked at further and was not consistent with the FRA findings. So several factors were identified for the higher frequency of daily trespassing events, and those attractors were schools, universities, social services, homeless services, restaurants, and other eating places in close proximity to the railroad right-of-way. Wrong direction. And less access. Some of those communities, the demographic information revealed that there was less access to vehicles for transportation in some of these communities. Greater density of racial minorities and greater density of low-income housing. So our needs are, we got some gaps in some of this research, and we need to answer the why, and maybe do some interviews with folks that are engaged in trespassing to ask them why are you trespassing? Did you know it's illegal? Those types of things to hear directly from these folks, and some polls about rail knowledge versus rail miss. Experienced a lot of that in my time here at NCDOT, and and then understanding the train noise propagation of how noise travels around trains. We need to look further at that as well. So that's my contact information. And I'm finished. I'm going to hand it over to Steve Burton. I'll copy and paste some links to Sarah's research in the chat for you all. Eugene?
Roger, thank you, Steve. Yeah, we see your slides coming up, and you're now good to go. And if you want to turn your camera on.
Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, and Roger, excellent presentation. Thank you very much for the important discussion on rail safety. I think one of the things that really stood out to me with your presentation was the discussion of Yasmin White. And, what I'm about to present on is more heavily involved with quantification and numbers, but I think I really appreciate you leading off and going first, because like you mentioned, it's not a victimless crime, and these are real people. So, presenting numbers, my hope is that it can be helpful, but it doesn't get to the magnitude of loss of life. So many of us are aware of rail collisions, and some of us grasp the severity, but we have not yet had an effective way to motivate change in safety outcomes across the board. So there's been a growing need for an accurate way to quantify the economic and social costs that result from the broad spectrum of events that occur on our railroad network. And by knowing the true cost of various types of rail incidents, we can be empowered, and we can also empower our leadership to make critical decisions that save lives. According to research from the National Academies of Sciences, policymakers often drastically underestimate the cost of rail incidents and are therefore less inclined to allocate scarce resources to rail safety countermeasures. So my purpose here today is to illuminate the cost of rail incidents in North Carolina, and I'll also be sharing a publicly available cost tool that can be used to demonstrate the full spectrum of costs associated with the various types of rail incidents that occur on our network. And it's my hope that this information can be used responsibly to provide support for rail safety countermeasures, as well as expanded safety training. Let's see here. Okay. Under the leadership of the North Carolina Rail Division and as part of Research Project 2044, we've developed a methodology for estimating the comprehensive cost of rail incidents across the state. And we've done this by piecing together valuable gems of information contained in journal articles, reports, data repositories, emergency dispatch records, and primary interviews. As I sort of alluded to before, our research has led to two primary outcomes. The first is an estimate of rail incident costs in North Carolina, and the second is a publicly available tool that can be used to estimate the economic and social costs that result from the various events that we see on the railroad. This was through and through a team effort, and if without the efforts of Roger Smock, Alex Demers, Chris Reichel, Jamal Pullen, John Dees, Tom Brown, and Nancy Horn, among others, we wouldn't have had such a strong methodological foundation. We also received expert corroboration from Jim Blaze, who's an author of Freight Waves and also an economist for passenger and freight rail. And he helped validate our cost appraisal methodology. We also received key input for this research from Shay Callahan, who's a principal economist from the American Association of Railroads. So really distilling all the literature review data and information, we have four primary cost categories that we evaluated in this study and included in the cost tool. And this included property damage, personal injury, and fatality, delay, rerouting, supply chain costs, and emergency responder costs. And I will get into those here. So for property damage, this includes all the costs that are incurred on the railroad to the rolling stock, tracks, other infrastructure in the railroad right of way. It includes highway vehicles, infrastructure, other property that may be impacted by a railroad incident. We use the Federal Railroad Administration Safety Database records, as well as the American Association of Railroads Component Repair and Replacement Cost Matrix to form the basis of our property damage estimates. And we use observations from 1990 through 2019. So 30 years of data documented in the FRA forms 6180.54 and .57 to assess our property damage values. We then converted these values to 2020 dollars for a consistent cost basis. And you know, as you might anticipate, there was a lot of variation in costs associated with the severity of an event. We found costs ranging from an estimated $3,500 per incident to over $7.8 million per occurrence. And this is based on a universe of about 1,100 incidents in North Carolina from 1990 through 2019. When evaluating casualties, so we looked at injuries and fatalities and the costs that accrue when an individual is injured or a fatality occurs on the railroad network. And for those of you that don't have an economics background like me, probably wondering, okay, well, how do you assess a monetary value to an injury or loss of life? You know, strictly speaking, there's a lot of challenges involved in equating a dollar value to human life. So what we did for this analysis was we used the best methodology available to us, and that was the United States Department of Transportation's benefit cost analysis guidance. And we used that documentation to monetize the costs associated with injuries and fatalities resulting from rail events. So this included using the maximum abbreviated injury scale, or MACE. And the MACE scale categorizes injuries along a 6-point scale from minor to not survivable. And we also recognize that crash data are often reported in a CABCO scale, which measures the observed severity of a victim's functional injury at the crash scene. So we wanted to make sure that our cost tool afforded the ability for users to be able to report in either the MACE or the CABCO scale. For this research, we looked at delay, rerouting, and supply chain costs, and those that encompass a variety of different costs that stem from the delay that results from a rail incident. Value of time costs, these accrue to trained passengers and to crew members. These are costs that accrue to human beings while they're experiencing delay. It's for this cost appraisal, we used USDOT's benefit cost analysis guidance, and then we used the Bureau of Labor Statistics wage rates in combination with delay records held in the Amtrak Status Max database to estimate the value of time costs for passengers and crew members. A good way to think about this is, you know, if you're being held up, you're unable to either get to work or to engage in a leisure or recreational pursuit, and both of these have economic value to either the economy or to personal individual. Shipper costs are experienced by businesses waiting to unload or receive cargo that is spoiled, deteriorated, or lost a portion of its useful life. And we use the methodology implemented in NCHRP Report 755, as well as research from Lovett et al. 2015 on freight rail delay costs in North America. And this is also widely available in applications of freight logistics. For our analysis, shipper costs are appraised using Winston and Shirley's methodology and NCDOT commodity mix data sources. And we apply cargo discount rates based on the type of goods being transported, as well as the length of delay that occurs. For cargo replacement costs, this is above and beyond a shipper cost. This is when cargo is actually destroyed and requires replacement. We used NCHRP 755's report methodology for this, as well as FRA data. And we used regression analysis to model the number of damaged rail cars that would occur per incident. And for the type of cargo that would be damaged within these rail cars, we use this using NCDOT commodity mix data sources. So this could either be waybill data as well as NC Freight report data. For our operating costs, a way to think about this, the greater amount of time that a train car or a locomotive is in use, the greater its operating costs. Lovett et al. Have a methodology that we use for this to estimate operating costs for locomotive ownership, leasing, and fuel, as well as the costs for operating other rail cars. And for emissions, there's a social cost that accrues when there are either carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, particulate matter emitted into the air. And these emissions accrue when we see increased idling or increased delay on the tracks. So we used USDOT's benefit cost analysis guidance, as well as Lovett et al.'s research for our analysis. And then last but definitely not least, we looked at how rail incidents impose delay costs upon trains involved, but also upon rail operators upstream and downstream of an incident. So by using Amtrak Status Map delay data and the NCHRP 755 reports methodology, we could appraise the upstream and downstream delay. And you know, tremendous thanks to all the counties and organizations that helped for this research. We had 21 counties respond, counties and organizations that provided us with dispatch records. So for events where we saw emergency responders from dispatch to close. We had a total of 246 timestamps for personnel and vehicles responding to an incident. And this data was made available and possible through North Carolina's public service answering points. So piecing all that data together, in 2019, there were 187 documented rail incidents in North Carolina that resulted in 96 injuries, 24 fatalities, and a total estimated cost of approximately $258.3 million. And the vast share of our incident costs come from injuries and fatalities, which directly links back to Roger's discussion of rail trespass incidents. If we're able to reduce these types of incidents, it would have a great impact on decreasing the economic cost and the social cost that we pay resulting from rail incidents in North Carolina. And looking back over the course of a decade, we see that there's an estimated 2.4 billion of accrued costs, and these costs stem from 1,870 reported incidents, which resulted in a total of 1,315 injuries and 223 fatalities. I'd like to take this time now to do a quick demonstration of the cost tool, and I'm going to navigate away from this page so that I can show the group really quickly where to find this tool online. So if I just put a search in the Google browser, NCDOT Comprehensive Cost of Rail Incidents, and then this will take you to the Connect NCDOT page. Has some good resources, an executive summary of the report, as well as some video tutorials, and you can download the cost tool, which is publicly available right here. I'm going to open up the cost tool, and what I would like to do is demonstrate for an incident that had occurred in August of 2019. There's some data that was shared, or some information that was shared in that article that we can use to help inform our assessment with the cost tool. So in Kernersville, there was a fatal incident that occurred when a train collided with a tractor trailer. We see that emergency officials responded at about 3:30 p.m. and that the event was expected to cause a closure throughout the night. So I'm going to have us lock away that information for our cost tool assessment. All right, let me try a new share here. Okay, now taking a look at the cost tool, I would like to go through, before I get started, if you notice there are 8 tabs across the bottom, and each of these has its unique purpose. If you go to the instructions tab, it provides a detailing of what each of the tabs are used for. And right here, I would say we're on sort of the home base, or the main part of the cost tool, where most of our information is added or tabulated. So this is where we make our cost estimate. There are color codings within the tool that designate the type of cost category, the cost element that we are dealing with. And as you go through the tool, you'll notice that there are yellow cells where you can input information, as well as if you go ahead and scroll over to the right part of the tool, there are benchmark values that can help you say, okay, if this is a less severe event, it might be on the lower end of the spectrum. If it's a more severe event, it might occur on the higher end of the spectrum. I recommend, when data is not available, to always use the median or the default values. Sometimes you'll have the opportunity for medium or mean. Anyway, the middle values are what I would advise when we don't have information. So thinking about the incident, we know that there was a collision between a freight train and a tractor trailer. So looking at the cost tool, we have 3 options to tabulate our property damage. One, if the rail damage costs are unknown, we would use option A. So that's a possibility. One is if the costs are known, we don't know the costs, so we wouldn't enter them there. And then another would be to build a more in-depth custom estimate. I would like us to just take a look at this tab because there's potentially an opportunity for more information here. So looking at our custom tab, we have some statistically significant factors that we could use to tabulate costs. So do we have any information about hazmat? No. Do we know number of locomotive units or trains derailed? No. Number of loaded freight cars, empty freight cars? No. But then if we take a look here, the number of train cars derailed, damage not specified, I think it would be a fair estimate to say, okay, where that train struck the tractor trailer, we would indeed have some damage to that rail car. So I'm gonna go ahead and input a custom value and say that one train car was damaged. We can also see if we have the type of incident, and scrolling through here, we have a highway rail crossing that applies. The type of user and highway user involved in the collision would be a truck trailer. And we don't have any information about hazmat. So I always think it's good to err on the side of caution and be conservative with economic estimates. So I would not put that in. So we can see that some of the values have populated here and have actually filled in for the cost tool. So I would say that would be a great place to go for the property damage. And then when looking at moving on to casualty and injury, you remember we had one fatality, we have the MACE scale or the CABCO scale. We could either input this information here, or likewise, if you wanted to input your fatality, you could do that here. So the next part of the tool involves looking at delay and supply chain costs. And the way I like to think about this, are we looking at an incident that involves a freight train or an incident that involves a passenger train? And it's color coded that way. So if we remember back, this was a freight train that struck a tractor trailer. So I'm actually gonna skip the passenger rail. These are all the red color coded parts of the tool, and head down to where we see the freight train delay. Now we're looking at any value of time costs. And for this section, we're looking at total minutes of delay. Now, if I can pull this up here, we see that the delay started at 3:30 p.m. where the incident occurred. And then it was an estimated that the network would be shut down until the morning, or 14 and a half hours. So we can actually go ahead and put that in as a custom value. I'm gonna put in 14.5 hours, multiply that times the number of minutes, because we're looking for time in minutes, and that'll have our delay value. Knowing that this is a freight incident, I just have the background where I know there's generally 2 engineers on board on average. I'm going to use the median salary, and then for incidence number, this would be the number of individuals that experience this type of incident. So we have 2 locomotive engineers, and now we have their value of time computed. Our next step would be to look at any sort of shipping costs that accrued. Remember, this is that lost increment of useful life as cargo is stranded on the track. Since we don't have any information about this, I recommend, again, using the default values. This same as 3i, this applies that 870 minutes of delay. And then I am going to use the default discount rate, or that default loss of useful life. And to get that, we used North Carolina Waybill commodity mix data. If you see that you click on that, it doesn't actually change the value. You could also use NCHRP values, which are slightly different, but in order to use North Carolina specific data values, we'll use the Waybill commodity mix. We don't have any indication in the article that there were any sort of rail cars that were derailed or any additional cargo that was destroyed. So I think I would just pass this section up. We want to make sure that we have a fair and conservative value. So we're not going to input any values in damaged or destroyed cargo. Upstream effects. This would be for the next frequency of trains coming down the tracks. So since we don't have any information from the article, again, we'll just use the median value. So this is telling us that at some point during that 14.5 hours on the railroad network, there was a delay experience of 26 minutes by another train that was going to come by. And I'm going to use the default crew size, their default wage rate, as well as the defaults here. Hopefully the tool can, as you see that I'm going along, it becomes sort of user-friendly where you pay attention to the color coding, as well as you know the what you're tabulating based on the labels. So we have our operating costs. This is an additional time on the tracks resulting from the delay. And we're going to use our defaults as well, since we don't have any more information from the article. And then beyond that, we also have our potential emissions factors that we need to take into consideration. So this would be our carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and our particulate matter. We use that 870 minutes of being stuck on the tracks and idling, and include our default values. I'm going through this fairly quickly. So, by all means, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can try to address those as well. For the last part of the tool, we have our first responder and emergency costs. And this part of the tool, it's important to be able to allocate or assign the type of incident that occurred to the way that it's categorized within the tool. And the reason for that is generally we found through our research, the type of emergency responder team, as well as the vehicle, so the personnel in the vehicles sent to respond to the scene, are associated with the type of event or the level of severity of that event. So looking here at the high impact event, based on 911 caller information, the rail event is likely to result in injuries and fatalities. We know that this is a fatality, so this is likely the event to choose. Very high impact, let's just make sure that's not the case. This is above and beyond a high impact. This is catastrophic injuries or fatalities. So we are good to use the high impact measure. And, again, based on research that I had done in the past, I know that law enforcement generally tends to be there for the entire time of that outage or that delay. So I put in a custom value of that 870 minutes, whereas the other responders may be more variable. They may be there for part of the incident, but not the whole time. So we're going to use the dispatch records, the mean values from those. So hazmat is one area that I will bypass. We did not have any information in the article that said that there were any hazmat teams dispatched. So I'm not going to include them in the estimate. And then again, I'm using the mean values here. And for time involved, whoops, I hope I didn't confuse anybody. I was going through this relatively quickly because I was trying to save time for questions. This should actually be a mean value and total time involved. This is where that custom value of 870 minutes should be applied. My apologies if that caused any confusion. And then I'm going to use for the personal time cost, those median wage rates. So these values are personnel cost per minute. So now we have our personnel cost that accrue. And I'd also like to include the costs associated with vehicles and equipment. I'm going to include everything in this except for a helicopter being dispatched. We did not receive any information that a helicopter was dispatched, and those are a little bit more unlikely or rare events. I'm importing my default values here. And again, if you notice total time, I'm going to look for the law enforcement. And this is where I would again put that custom value of 870 minutes because the law enforcement vehicles were there for the entirety of that incident. All right, putting in the medium values for our vehicle operating costs. These costs come from FEMA's schedule of costs. And now we have actually made it through the entire cost tool. So at this point, you can see which cost elements we have monetized and which we have not. We purposely skipped damaged or destroyed cargo, and then we did not include any of the passenger rail events because this was an event that was concerned with freight rail. So I hope that this tool share or demo was helpful for you, and I'd love to turn it back now for an opportunity to address any sort of questions that may have come up. Maybe Eugene, I will pass it over to you.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. Great presentation by you and Roger. We appreciate it. And we are running tight on time, but I do want to give us a bit of time for questions. And let me also point out, while Steve has been presenting, we've added some information for folks in the chat window. Some links. Roger, as he mentioned, posted a couple of links in chat. So if you open up the chat, you'll be able to see those hyperlinks and grab those. And following today's presentation, I'll leave the webinar session open a bit longer so you can grab those links. And also make mention that the slides that both Roger and Steve have shared today, we'll be posting those for download to our traffic safety webinar website as soon as we get the recording posted. And Steve, I would ask if there's a link to the tool that you just demonstrated, if you'd like to put that into the chat as well.
Absolutely, Eugene. I will do that.
So while we're waiting for any questions, remember, if you got a question, you can type it into Q&A or just simply raise your hand, and be happy to call on you and give you the microphone so you can ask that directly. But I do want to follow up, Roger and Steve, with a couple of questions here. First of all, what do you anticipate the cost tool would be used for, and who do you think are its primary audiences?
Eugene, I can answer that. I appreciate that question. You know, it's my hope that this would be a tool that would be most valuable for the leadership level. So either looking at value of use from NCDOT or MPOs, RPOs. The thought would be, if the tool is able to be used, it can help with some of that really difficult decision making associated with trade-offs. I know that allocating scarce budget resources is often very difficult, and without having an accurate assessment or accurate measure of knowing, okay, here are the costs that we're dealing with, it's hard to make that decision. So my goal was to hopefully have the tool be a source of empowerment for NCDOT, MPOs, RPOs when they're making decisions on where to allocate funding and potentially a justification for rail safety countermeasures.
Steve, thank you for that. We have a question in Q&A for Roger. Roger, the question is, are rail agencies using trespassing data to generate prioritized locations to improve or mitigate pedestrian trespassing issues? Your data set may reveal opportunities for targeted municipal partnerships to improve pedestrian connections along rail corridors.
That's a great question, Mr. Nicholas. To my knowledge, they are using rail trespass data, and their work, most of their work, the rail agencies that we're talking about mostly are the large Class 1 railroads and some larger short line or regional railroads, and they work closely with the the Operation Lifesaver national program, which is a rail safety nonprofit supported by FRA and those large Class 1 railroads. So to some extent, and I did make our Sarah's latest research known to colleagues in VOPE and FRA as well, and I'm hoping they do use those data.
Roger, thank you for that. And thanks for that question as well. Steve, another follow-up about the tool. Is there an opportunity for users to provide feedback about the cost tool so that it can better meet users' needs?
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. Another good question. So, one of the reasons why I'm here today is to hopefully gather feedback and also to make sure that the tool can be used to help really make policy changes in a way that it can be helpful for rail safety. So if there are, anybody out there today, or, if anybody out there today speaks to anybody else, if there are ways to improve the tool, I would be open ears and would love to try to make the tool as useful as possible. So yes, by all means, you can please feel free to email me sburt@planningcommunities.com, or otherwise, if you're more comfortable speaking with Roger, let Roger know, and then we're coordinating in this effort and would like to make sure that the tool is updated. And just as a caveat to that, I know in 1 year I'm planning on updating the cost tool values so that they are displayed in 2021 dollars. Right now, everything is in 2020 dollars. So at the very least, that improvement will be made to stay current with the time. And I'd also love to hear feedback on other ways that the tool could be most valuable to our audience. Thanks, Eugene.
Steve, thank you for that response. And so I don't see any more questions in the queue or any hands raised, and we are at our normally scheduled end time. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up, but just to let folks know, in the follow-up email that you'll get, you'll also have contact information for both Roger and Steve if you have any additional questions for them offline. So with that, I want to say thank you again very much to Roger and Steve for your presentation and for everyone who joined us today. And before you leave the meeting, feel free to use Q&A to share any suggestions to help improve our webinar series and to including any future topics that you'd like to learn more about. As I mentioned, following today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording link, so be sure to watch for that email. In the email, we'll also include a link if you'd like to get a participation certificate for today's webinar. So be sure to use the link in the email to request that. If you are a professional engineer watching today, you will earn 1 PDH for participating in the webinar. And there will also be a separate link to in the email to fill out your NC Bell's evaluation link. If you are actually watching the recording at this moment, please note that we can only award certificates for participation in the live webinar, not for watching the recording. We invite you to join us again for other traffic safety webinars planned for this series. So please visit our website at this link on your screen for a listing of upcoming webinars, as well as at the same link, you'll find the recordings of all of our past webinars. And at this same website, you'll find information about the next North Carolina Traffic Safety Conference and Expo. We hope you will plan to attend that conference. We also invite you to propose topics for presentation. There's a link on the website for presentation proposals, so you can use that to submit your ideas. And that's all I have for today. So again, thank you very much for participating in today's webinar, And until next time, goodbye for now.